For 30 years, Elias Thorne didn't just grow apples, he grew silence.
What's in the folder, Elias?
While the rest of the county was paved over with gray concrete and pulsating neon signs, his 10-acre orchard remained a stubborn, emerald patch of defiance. Then came the developers, a faceless entity with bottomless pockets and a hunger for total annexation. They didn't just want his land, they wanted his history. They bought every single acre around him, encircling his sanctuary like wolves tightening a perimeter. They cut off his access, dimmed his horizon, and waited for the silence to break. But they made one fatal, arrogant calculation. They thought they were dealing with a man who had nowhere to go, when in reality, they were trapped in a cage with him. The air inside the orchard tasted different. It was crisp, laden with the scent of damp earth and late summer honeycrisps. Elias knew every tree by its temperament. He knew which branches sagged under the weight of excessive fruit, and which ones needed a gentle prune to invite the morning light. His grandfather had planted these rows in 1946, a homecoming gift after the war, and Elias had spent his entire life honoring that promise. While the town of Oakhaven transformed into a bustling, smog-choked hub of commercial logistics, the orchard remained an anomaly. It was a time capsule. During the spring, the white blossoms created a sea of froth that looked like fallen clouds against the dark, rich soil. In autumn, the canopy turned into a mosaic of burnt orange and crimson. To the townspeople, the orchard was a relic, a nice place to visit for a photo, but an obstacle to progress. To the developers, however, it was a multi-million-dollar opportunity disguised as an eyesore. The campaign against Elias began with a whisper. A shell company, Apex Horizon Holdings, started buying up the failing wheat fields to his north. Then the residential properties to the east. The owners of those properties didn't hesitate. They were offered 3 times the market value, their eyes gleaming with the promise of early retirement in warmer climates. Elias watched from his porch as the tractors arrived. Not to plow, but to demolish. Within 2 years, the orchard was a green island in a sea of construction dust. The developers didn't stop at buying the land. They began a psychological war of attrition. They built high-intensity floodlights along the new property lines, turning his nights into a perpetual, harsh white dawn. They operated heavy machinery at 3 a.m., the vibration of the earth shaking the delicate root systems of his heirloom trees. They thought he would crack. Every Friday, a man in a crisp, charcoal suit named Mr. Vane would show up at Elias's front gate. He was the human face of Apex, a man whose smile never reached his eyes. Elias, Vane would say, checking his watch. The offer has increased. 10 million. You could live like a king anywhere else. Why stay here and watch these trees die from the dust? Elias would just lean against his gate, chewing on a piece of straw. They aren't dying, Mr. Vane. They're just waiting. Waiting for what? The bulldozers? Waiting for the seasons, Elias would reply calmly. The developers took this as a sign of senility. They figured if they could make the orchard economically unviable, block his delivery trucks, ruin his crop yield with construction silt, and bury him in zoning violations, he would eventually sign the papers just to be rid of the misery. They didn't understand the nature of the man they were dealing with. They saw a farmer, they didn't see an archivist. Elias spent his days doing exactly what his grandfather had taught him, but his nights were different. After the heavy machinery finally quieted down at 4 a.m., he would head into his small, dust-covered study. He wasn't crying or preparing to pack. He was reading. He had boxes of yellowing deeds, geological survey maps from the 1920s. And local ordnance records that predated the very town of Oakhaven. He was looking for something. Not a way to win a fight, but a way to prove that the fight had already been won a century ago. He knew the developers relied on the arrogance of modern ownership. They looked at the tax maps and saw numbers. Elias looked at the history and saw truth. He found the first crack in their armor on a rainy Tuesday, hidden inside a water-stained ledger from the county land registrar. It wasn't just a document, it was a ghost story with legal teeth. If the first phase of the development was annexation, the second was pure, unadulterated psychological warfare. Apex Horizon Holdings realized that money wasn't going to work, so they transitioned to a strategy of managed misery. They didn't want to just buy the land anymore, they wanted to break the man who owned it. The idea was to make the orchard feel like a prison rather than a home. They started by erecting a massive, sound-dampening wall along the southern border of his property. On the surface, they claimed it was for his protection, to keep the construction noise out. In reality, it was a 12-foot concrete slab that blocked his view of the valley and created a wind tunnel that shredded the blossoms of his prize-winning Honeycrisps. The wall was ugly, imposing, and strategically designed to make Elias feel small. Then came the environmental impact investigations. Nearly every week, a new inspector arrived in a white truck, clipboard in hand, looking for reasons to condemn the property. They scrutinized his irrigation system, claiming he was violating new water rights laws that had been fast-tracked through the city council. They tested his soil, trying to find traces of runoff from the construction site, only to try to flip the blame back onto him, accusing him of polluting the construction project with unauthorized chemical fertilizers. Elias handled them with a terrifying level of patience. He greeted every inspector with a glass of cool water and a polite demeanor, guiding them through the rows as if they were honored guests. He never argued. He never raised his voice. When they found a violation, he would simply nod, take the citation, and fix it by the following day. It frustrated the developers to no end. They wanted a fight, they wanted him to scream, to block their trucks, to give them a reason to call the sheriff and have him hauled away for obstruction. But Elias was playing a different game. He understood that the developers were operating on a timeline. They had investors to please and construction loans with aggressive interest rates. They needed this land cleared now. Every day he delayed them was a day of lost revenue for them, but he couldn't just keep fixing things indefinitely. Eventually, they would find something he couldn't fix. The turning point in their psychological strategy came in the form of the Great Dusting. During a particularly dry stretch in July, the construction crews began excavating the foundation for a massive warehouse complex just 50 yards from the orchard fence. They didn't bother with water trucks to keep the dirt down. A constant, thick plume of gray dust settled over the orchard, coating the leaves, clogging the pores of the trees, and turning the vibrant green canopy a deathly, muted slate. Elias watched from his porch. His lungs burned, and his eyes were constantly irritated, but he didn't move. He sat in his rocking chair, watching the dust coat his life's work. A reporter from the local newspaper, the Oakhaven Gazette, showed up one afternoon. She was clearly in the pocket of the developers, hoping to capture a photo of a defeated, coughing old man to run a headline like, "The Last Harvest, a Stubborn Relic Fades." "Mr. Thorne," she asked, her camera lens clicking away. "The conditions here are clearly hazardous. The town is worried about the dust getting into the air supply of the new community center. Don't you think it's time to accept the buyout and move somewhere safer? You're suffering for a few trees." Elias looked at her, his face covered in a fine layer of gray powder. He smiled, and for the first time, there was a glint in his eyes that looked less like exhaustion and more like anticipation. "The trees are breathing," he said, his voice raspy. "They're built for the elements. They've seen worse than a little dirt. They've seen the seasons change for 80 years. I think they'll survive the summer." The story ran the next day, but it didn't have the effect the developers wanted. The public, while largely supportive of the new jobs and infrastructure, began to feel a strange, creeping unease. There was something about the image of a solitary man in a dust storm that tapped into a primal fear of corporate overreach. The David narrative was beginning to take hold, and that was exactly what Elias needed. He wasn't just sitting there, though. Every night, while the security lights of the construction site hummed, he was in his study, cross-referencing the land use permits the developers had filed with the historical survey maps he'd found. He was looking for the overlap, that specific intersection of land where the past met the present. He needed to prove that the land Apex was building on wasn't just theirs, it was legally encumbered in a way that would bring their entire multi-million-dollar machine to a screeching halt. He found it around 2 a.m. It was tucked behind a property tax assessment from 1952. A handwritten note, signed by the original landowners of the entire valley, included a restrictive covenant that had been glossed over by every title company in the county. It was a conservation easement that wasn't just about the land, but about the water rights beneath it. He realized that if he could prove the orchard held the senior rights to the aquifer, Apex wasn't just building on land, they were building on a liability that would cost them everything. By mid-August, the psychological siege turned into a physical one. Apex Horizon Holdings abandoned the pretense of negotiation and shifted into a gear of aggressive intimidation. They realized that their PR campaign, painting Elias as a delusional hoarder, was losing steam. The more they pushed, the more the public viewed Elias not as a nuisance, but as a martyr. To counter this, Apex decided they didn't need to win the public's heart, they just needed to starve the orchard of its resources. One Tuesday morning, the humming of the heavy machinery abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was far more ominous than the noise. Elias stepped out onto his porch, coffee in hand, expecting a reprieve. Instead, he saw a fleet of large, industrial-grade water tanker trucks parked directly against his fence line. They weren't there for construction, they were there for extraction. The developers had purchased the water rights to the abandoned wheat field surrounding his land, and they were now using high-powered drills to tap into the same deep-level aquifer that fed his orchard's intricate root system. Within hours, the soil began to dry. The vibrant, deep green leaves of his trees, which had withstood 80 years of drought and flood, began to wilt. It was a calculated, lethal strike. If they couldn't buy the land, they would turn the land into a graveyard. The town's attitude shifted rapidly. The narrative changed from stubborn farmer to economic bottleneck. The local news began running segments on how Elias's selfish refusal to sell was preventing the development of a state-of-the-art tech campus that would bring 3,000 jobs to Oakhaven. The pressure was intense. Local business owners stopped serving him. His mailbox was stuffed with anonymous, threatening letters. People he had known his entire life, the grocer, the mechanic, the postman, began to look at him with a mixture of pity and resentment. "You're killing this town's future, Elias," the local sheriff told him during a welfare check that felt more like a shakedown. "I've got kids who need jobs. The school board is counting on that tax revenue. You're just one man with a dying orchard. Is this really the hill you want to die on?" Elias leaned against the cooling unit of his refrigerator. He looked tired, older than he had even a week ago. The stress was physically eroding him, but his resolve remained an iron rod. "Sheriff, you're looking at the trees and seeing firewood. You're looking at the jobs and seeing prosperity. But you're not looking at what lies beneath. If I leave, and if this place is paved over, it's not just the trees that disappear. It's the stability of this whole valley." The sheriff just shook his head, sighed, and left, leaving Elias alone in the growing heat. The orchard was reaching a critical point of dehydration. The leaves were brittle, curling into themselves like charred paper. The fruit, the beautiful, heavy honeycrisps he had spent all season nurturing, began to drop prematurely, thudding against the dry, cracked earth. It was a rhythmic, agonizing sound, like a countdown. Every evening, Mr. Vane from Apex would drive his pristine sedan to the gate. He didn't even get out of the car anymore. He would roll down the window, light a cigarette, and wait for Elias to come out. "I can hear them dying, Elias," Vane said one night, the smoke curling around his face. "You've got maybe 48 hours before the roots go necrotic. Once that happens, there's no coming back. You'll have 10 acres of dead wood and worthless dirt. Why not take the payout today? It's $5 million now. Tomorrow. I'm withdrawing the offer entirely. I'll just wait for the bank to foreclose on you when you can't pay your water taxes." Elias stood there, his hand gripping the gate. He could smell the desperation on Vane. The company was overleveraged, they were bleeding cash, and they needed this project to launch by the end of the quarter or their lead investors would pull the plug. They weren't just winning, they were desperate. And desperation, as any farmer knows, makes for sloppy mistakes. That night, the heat was suffocating. Elias went to his study, but he didn't reach for his ledgers. He reached for his phone. He made one call, a call he had been waiting to make for months. He spoke for 10 minutes, his voice low and steady. When he hung up, he looked out the window at the orchard. He saw the silhouettes of his trees against the moonlit haze of the construction site. The next morning, the bulldozers were primed to start the final leveling of the surrounding property. Vane was there, wearing a suit that cost more than Elias's tractor, smiling with the confidence of a man who held all the cards. The media was there, too, a camera crew from the city, ready to film the triumphant destruction of the final holdout. Elias walked out of his farmhouse. He wasn't carrying a protest sign or a weapon. He was carrying a single, weathered folder. He walked right up to the line where the construction crews were idling. The cameras swiveled toward him. The reporters leaned in, expecting an emotional outburst, a plea for mercy, or a tearful resignation. He didn't give them any of that. He walked over to Vane, who was standing by the lead bulldozer, and handed him a document. "I think you might want to read this before you turn the key," Elias said, his voice carrying clearly over the microphone the reporter held out. Vane laughed, waving the paper away. "Whatever this is, it's over, Elias. This is your eviction notice." "It's not an eviction notice," Elias replied, his eyes cold and calm. "It's a lien on the future of this entire project." Mr. Vane's smirk flickered, momentarily replaced by a shadow of genuine uncertainty. He took the folder, his thumb tracing the edges of the brittle, yellowed paper inside. The camera crews crowded closer, their boom mics hovering like predatory birds, eager to capture the sound of a broken man finally surrendering. But as Vane scanned the first page, his face drained of color. He stopped moving. The ambient noise of the construction site, the idling engines, the distant shouts of workers, seemed to fade into a hollow, static hum. "What is this?" Vane whispered, his voice losing its polished veneer. "It's an original survey and land grant codicil," Elias said, his voice measured and firm. "Filed in 1924, and never once vacated by any subsequent transaction. You didn't check the historical archives for the aquifer rights, did you, Mr. Vane? You only checked the modern digital database. That was your first mistake." The document in Vane's hand was a restrictive covenant that effectively designated the underlying water table of the orchard as a protected, non-commercial resource. More importantly, it stipulated that any industrial activity within a 5-mile radius that altered the flow of the subterranean basin was not just a violation of local ordinance, it was a breach of a century-old environmental trust. The penalty was not a fine, it was the immediate, permanent forfeiture of all land rights associated with the holding company that attempted to bypass the restriction. The atmosphere around the construction site shifted instantly from a victory march to a crime scene. Vane tried to regain his composure, his hand trembling slightly as he held the paper. "This is hearsay, Thorne. A dusty piece of paper from 100 years ago doesn't trump modern zoning laws. We have the city council's approval. We have the permits." "You have the permits," Elias countered, "but you built on a foundation of legal quicksand. That covenant is attached to the deeds of every acre you've acquired in this valley. You didn't buy the land clear, you bought a liability. Every dollar you've spent moving earth, every dollar you've poured into these foundations, is tied to this land. And if this land is under a protected easement, that money is legally forfeited to the state if the violation is proven." The reality of the situation began to dawn on the surrounding construction managers. They started to shut down the engines. The silence that swept over the site was absolute. The reporter, sensing a much larger story than a simple eviction, shoved the microphone closer. "Mr. Vane, can you comment on the validity of these documents? Is it true that the entire Apex Horizon project is facing a legal block?" Vane looked from the document to the cameras, then to Elias. The predatory confidence he had exuded for weeks was gone, replaced by the panicked look of an executive whose career was evaporating in real time. He tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. He knew in his gut that Elias wasn't bluffing. The document was a masterclass in legal leverage, drafted in a time when land rights were absolute and ironclad. Elias walked back toward his porch, his gait steady, his head held high. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew that the moment he had handed that folder over, the momentum had shifted permanently. The legal trap wasn't something he had stumbled upon, it was the foundation upon which he had lived his entire life. He had been a guardian, not just of trees, but of the very laws that kept the valley from turning into a concrete wasteland. Inside his house, Elias sat down. His hands were finally shaking. The adrenaline was receding, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He watched through his window as the scene outside dissolved into chaos. Suits were emerging from black SUVs, shouting into cell phones, gesturing wildly. The developers were desperately trying to verify the document, but the court clerk's office was already closed for the weekend, giving them 48 hours of pure, unadulterated terror. He had spent years being the villain in the eyes of the town, the selfish old man who refused to move. Now, he was the only thing standing between the truth and a corporate cover-up. He realized that the townspeople were starting to gather at the fence line, not to jeer, but to watch in stunned silence. They were seeing the man they had dismissed as a relic suddenly hold the keys to their future. The legal battle that would follow was inevitable. Apex would throw millions at lawyers to try and discredit the document, but the law was the law. The covenant was clear, the chain of custody for the land deeds was unbroken, and the environmental protection clauses were explicit. Elias had effectively checkmated a billion-dollar entity with a piece of paper that had cost him nothing but time, patience, and the courage to wait for the right moment. He wasn't fighting for the apples anymore. He was fighting to preserve the integrity of the soil itself. He realized that if he had sold out, the entire basin would have been drained, the wells of the surrounding homes would have run dry within a decade, and the history of Oakhaven would have been paved over. He was the only one who had bothered to read the fine print, the only one who understood that progress without history is just destruction. The following Monday, the courtroom was packed. It wasn't just the press, the entire town of Oakhaven had descended upon the county seat. The mood was electric, a volatile mixture of hostility and newfound curiosity. Mr. Vane sat at the defense table, his composure replaced by a tight-lipped, hollow-eyed stare. He looked like a man who hadn't slept since the moment he touched the document. When Elias entered, he wasn't wearing his usual farm clothes. He wore a suit that had belonged to his father, a bit loose in the shoulders, smelling slightly of cedar and old books, but he carried himself with an authority that silenced the room. He didn't look like a farmer anymore, he looked like a statesman. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for punishing corporate overreach, hammered her gavel. "We are here regarding the injunction filed by Elias Thorne against Apex Horizon Holdings. Mr. Vane, your counsel has argued that the document submitted by Mr. Thorne is an archaic nuisance. Do you still stand by that assessment?" Vane's lead attorney stood up, his voice booming. "Your Honor, this is a desperate attempt to stall progress. A 100-year-old restrictive covenant on water usage is a relic of an era that bears no relevance to our modern infrastructure. The land was purchased in good faith. We demand the injunction be lifted immediately so our client can resume development." The judge looked at the attorney, then at Elias. "Mr. Thorne, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes to prove why this document carries the weight you claim." Elias stood. He didn't approach the stand, he simply walked to the center of the floor. He pulled out a large, hand-drawn map of the county, overlaying it with the geological data he had spent decades collecting. "The council calls this a relic," Elias began, his voice clear and resonant, filling every corner of the room. "But there is a reason this land was protected in 1924. This isn't just about my orchard. It isn't just about my trees. If you look at this geological survey, you will see that the aquifer feeding this entire valley, including the town's water supply, the local elementary school, and every private well within 5 miles, is connected to a singular, ancient limestone shelf. My orchard sits directly above the primary recharge point of that shelf." He pointed to a red circle on the map. He wore a suit that had belonged to his father, a bit loose in the shoulders, smelling slightly of cedar and old books, but he carried himself with an authority that silenced the room. He didn't look like a farmer anymore, he looked like a statesman. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for punishing corporate overreach, hammered her gavel. "We are here regarding the injunction filed by Elias Thorne against Apex Horizon Holdings. Mr. Vane, your counsel has argued that the document submitted by Mr. Thorne is an archaic nuisance. Do you still stand by that assessment?" Vane's lead attorney stood up, his voice booming. "Your Honor, this is a desperate attempt to stall progress. A 100-year-old restrictive covenant on water usage is a relic of an era that bears no relevance to our modern infrastructure. The land was purchased in good faith. We demand the injunction be lifted immediately so our client can resume development." The judge looked at the attorney, then at Elias. Mr. Thorne, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes to prove why this document carries the weight you claim. Elias stood. He didn't approach the stand, he simply walked to the center of the floor. He pulled out a large, hand-drawn map of the county, overlaying it with the geological data he had spent decades collecting. The council calls this a relic, Elias began, his voice clear and resonant, filling every corner of the room. But there is a reason this land was protected in 1924. This isn't just about my orchard. It isn't just about my trees. If you look at this geological survey, you will see that the aquifer feeding this entire valley, including the town's water supply, the local elementary school, and every private well within 5 miles, is connected to a singular, ancient limestone shelf. My orchard sits directly above the primary recharge point of that shelf. He pointed to a red circle on the map. The developers wanted to build a massive industrial complex, which would have required massive excavation and deep well drilling. If they had proceeded, they would have breached the limestone cap. The contamination from their industrial runoff, combined with the permanent depletion of the aquifer, wouldn't just have killed my orchard. It would have poisoned the water for the entire town of Oakhaven. The covenant wasn't written to protect an orchard, it was written to protect the lifeblood of this valley. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The townspeople, who had spent months calling Elias a selfish obstacle, suddenly realized they were looking at the man who had secretly saved their own wells from being drained and poisoned. And, Elias continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that commanded total silence, the hidden detail that the developers missed wasn't just the covenant. It was a clause added by the original owners in 1926. It stated that if any owner of the surrounding land ever attempted to compromise the integrity of this recharge point, the title to their land would immediately revert to the public trust for the establishment of a permanent, protected nature reserve. The room erupted. Vane's face went white. The attorneys scrambled to flip through their files, but they knew they had lost. The document was legally airtight, a masterclass in foresight that had effectively turned the developer's own investment into a donation to the people of Oakhaven. In short, Elias finished, they didn't buy the land. They bought their own eviction. The fallout was swift. The judge ruled in favor of the injunction, declaring the entire construction site a protected environmental zone. The developers, facing massive litigation from their own shareholders for failing to perform basic due diligence, filed for bankruptcy within the week. Their equipment was sold off to pay back the town for the damage they had done to the roads and the environment. As for the orchard, it didn't just survive, it thrived. The town, having realized the danger they were narrowly spared, organized a community effort to clean up the construction dust and restore the land. What had been a site of greed and conflict became a symbol of preservation. The orchard became a city-sanctioned landmark, a place where people would go to walk under the trees and remember that sometimes, the most important work isn't done by those with the loudest voices, but by the one who knows when to hold his ground. Elias eventually retired, but he never left. He spent his final years sitting on his porch, watching the children of Oakhaven play in the rows of trees he had fought so hard to protect. He didn't need the money, he didn't need the fame, and he certainly didn't need the developers. He had his silence, he had his apples, and most importantly, he had the truth. The story of the boy who revealed one hidden detail became a local legend, a story told to every child in Oakhaven about the man who kept the lights on, the water flowing, and the world from turning into just another gray slab of pavement. The orchard stands today as it always has, a stubborn, emerald patch of life in a world that forgot how to be quiet.